Giant Mountain Man hadn't kissed a woman in 12 years, until she whispered, "Please cut these ropes." He thought the world forgot him. Up in the high country, with only snow and silence. But when he found her, tied to a tree, lips cracked, eyes burning, he knew his quiet life was over. What kind of men leave a woman like that? Men who want more than her life. Men who'll trade water, land, and blood for a forged paper. But what she carries in her hand isn't just a deed. It's the key to who lives and who dies in this valley. He's just one man, giant, stubborn, heartbroken. But mercy can be heavier than a bullet. When the fires are lit and the town turns its back, will he find the courage to fight for her future? Or will his silence bury them all? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in weak grays as Elias Boone's axe bit deep into another log. Sweat froze on his brow despite the brutal cold. His muscles, hardened by years of mountain living, barely registered the strain anymore. The steady rhythm of metal striking wood echoed across the silent valley. His hound dog, he'd never bothered giving her a proper name, suddenly lifted her head from where she lay near the woodpile. Her lips pulled back in a low growl, eyes fixed on the creek bottom below. Elias paused mid-swing, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "What you got there, girl?" The hound's growl deepened. Elias set his axe against the chopping block and retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall. Living alone in these mountains had taught him caution. He followed Dog down the snowy slope toward the creek, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice atop the powder. The first flakes of new snow began to fall as they approached the line of bare cottonwoods along the water. That's when he saw her. A woman was bound to one of the larger trees, her head slumped forward. Dark hair fell across her face, but he could see she wore traditional Navajo dress beneath a thin wool blanket. His heart clenched at the sight of rope burns on her wrists, where she'd clearly struggled against her bonds. Dog whined and pressed against his leg. Elias approached slowly, rifle ready, scanning the creek bottom for whoever might have done this. But the only tracks in the fresh snow led away to the north, hours old now. The woman's head lifted at his approach. Despite the blue tinge to her lips and the frost crystals in her hair, her dark eyes blazed with determination. "Please," she whispered, her voice rough from cold and thirst, "cut these ropes!" Elias hesitated. 12 years of solitude had built walls around his heart, thicker than the cabin logs that sheltered him. The last time he'd let someone in. He pushed away memories of Sarah's fever-bright eyes, her final rattling breath. But he couldn't leave this woman to freeze. Whatever complications helping her might bring, his conscience wouldn't allow it. "Hold still," he said gruffly, drawing his knife. The ropes parted with 2 quick slices. She stumbled forward as her arms came free, but Elias caught her before she could fall. Her skin felt like ice through the thin fabric of her dress. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy buffalo robe and wrapped it around her shoulders. When she swayed on her feet, he swept her up in his arms as easily as gathering kindling. She was tall for a woman, but decades of mountain life had left him strong as a bear. "I'm taking you to my cabin," he said. "Can warm up there?" She nodded, teeth chattering too hard to speak. Her head rested against his chest as he carried her up the slope, Dog trotting anxiously beside them. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes catching in his beard. By the time they reached the cabin, a proper mountain storm was brewing. Elias shouldered open the door and ducked inside with his burden. He settled her in his one chair by the pot-bellied stove, where embers still glowed from the night before. Working quickly, he added kindling and fresh logs until flames crackled to life. The woman held her frozen hands toward the growing warmth. "Name's Elias Boone," he said, moving to put coffee on. "Most folks just call me Boone." Marisol 10 bears. Her voice was stronger now, though still rough. I am grateful for your help, Mr. Boone. He grunted acknowledgement as he examined her wrists and ankles. The rope burns were ugly, but no serious frostbite that he could see. Still, her ordeal could have killed her if he hadn't found her when he did. Questions crowded his mind as he wrapped her wounds with clean cloth. Who would do this to a woman? Why here, in his valley? He'd chosen this remote spot precisely because it lay far from the usual troubles between settlers and natives. But he kept his questions to himself for now. The woman, Marisol, clearly needed rest and warmth more than interrogation. He poured coffee into his 1-tin cup and pressed it into her trembling hands. Much obliged, she murmured, sipping carefully at the steaming liquid. Elias busied himself laying out trail biscuits and jerky on the rough-hewn table, keeping one eye on his unexpected guest. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she held herself with dignity. There was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes that spoke of someone used to standing her ground. The storm howled outside now, rattling the cabin's shutters. Dog curled protectively at Marisol's feet, as if she'd appointed herself guardian. Elias found himself studying the woman's face, noting the strength in her features, the wisdom in her eyes. For the first time in 12 years, his lonely cabin felt different. Warmer, somehow, despite the raging winter beyond its walls. Morning sunlight crept through the small window of the line shack, casting pale squares across the plank floor. Marisol stirred from her place near the pot-bellied stove, where Elias had made her a bed from his spare blankets. Dog lifted her head from where she'd kept watch all night, her tail thumping softly against the floorboards. Elias already had coffee brewing and a pot of corn mush bubbling on the stove. He'd been up since before dawn, restless with questions about his unexpected guest. He nodded as Marisol sat up, her long dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders. "How are them rope burns?" he asked, spooning mush into 2 wooden bowls. "Better." Marisol flexed her wrists carefully. The angry red marks stood out against her brown skin, but the swelling had gone down. "Your medicines helped." Elias set a bowl before her, along with some strips of jerky. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crack of the fire and the wind whistling through the cabin's chinked logs. Finally, Marisol set down her spoon. "I must tell you why those men left me to die." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached into the folds of her dress. She withdrew a folded paper, creased and worn, but still official-looking with its red seal. "This is a legal deed to Thunder Spring," she said, "the main water source for the whole valley. My late husband and I filed it with Judge Hayworth himself. The Indian agent signed as witness." Elias took the document with careful hands, squinting at the formal writing. He wasn't much for reading, but he recognized the territorial court seal and Judge Hayworth's precise signature at the bottom. "Mace Holcomb and his gang," Marisol continued, her voice hardening. "They're claim jumpers. They've been forging papers, stealing water rights across tribal lands. When they learned of our deed..." She touched her bruised wrists. "They took my horse, my supplies, left me tied to that tree to freeze." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard of Holcomb. Most folks in the territory had. The man posed as a legitimate land speculator, but stories of missing deeds and mysteriously changed property lines followed in his wake. Few dared stand against him. "That spring's been in my husband's family for generations," Marisol said. "The water gives life to our gardens, our sheep. Without it..." She straightened her shoulders. "I will not let them steal my son's inheritance." Elias stood abruptly, moving to the window. The morning sun gleamed on fresh snow, peaceful and bright. He'd chosen this remote cabin precisely to avoid such troubles. After Sarah died, he'd wanted nothing to do with other folks' wars, but something tugged at his soul. The thought of that gang terrorizing a widow, trying to steal her rightful water. It went against everything he believed about justice, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He turned back to find Marisol watching him, her dark eyes steady. She didn't beg or plead. She simply stated her truth and waited. "Reckon you'll need help getting to town," he said finally. "Snow's deep. Wolves are running bold this winter." "I would be grateful for your guidance," she replied carefully. "But I know this may bring trouble to your door." Elias snorted. "Trouble found my door when I found you in them cottonwoods." But there was no blame in his voice, only wry acceptance. They finished their meal in companionable silence. Marisol insisted on helping clean up, moving with quiet grace despite her ordeal. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how naturally she fit into the cabin's routine. It had been so long since he'd shared space with another person. As dusk approached, painting the snow in purple shadows, Elias retrieved his old hunting knife from its peg by the door. The blade had grown dull with disuse. He preferred his newer Bowie for daily tasks. But something about this knife, with its worn bone handle and the memories it carried, felt right for what lay ahead. He settled onto his bench, working the blade carefully against his whetstone. The familiar rhythm of steel on stone filled the cabin as darkness gathered outside. Each stroke of the knife was like a heartbeat, marking the end of his solitary life. Marisol sat nearby, mending a tear in her dress by the lamp's glow. Dog drowsed between them, content in the shared warmth of human company. Neither spoke, but the silence held a weight of understanding. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. The pale winter sun crept over the eastern ridge as Elias led his mule from the lean-to shelter behind his cabin. His breath frosted in the crisp morning air while he secured worn leather saddlebags across the animal's broad back. Inside, he'd packed jerky, coffee, hardtack, and extra blankets, enough for 3 days' travel to Dry Fork. He paused at the cabin door, holding Sarah's old winter coat. The brown wool was still sturdy, though it had hung untouched for 12 years. His rough fingers traced the wooden buttons before he turned to Marisol. "It ain't much to look at, but it'll keep you warm." His voice was gruff, fighting the emotion that rose whenever he touched Sarah's things. Marisol accepted the coat with both hands, treating it with gentle reverence. "Thank you. I will care for it well." She slipped it on, the hem falling just above her ankles. Though her movements were careful due to her injuries, she insisted on mounting the mule herself. "I can ride," she said firmly, when Elias moved to help. "We must reach Dry Fork before Holcomb files his false claim." They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, following the creek trail south. Fresh snow blanketed the valley, unmarred except for deer tracks and the occasional rabbit print. Dog trotted ahead, nose to the ground, while their mule picked its way carefully through the drifts. The morning wore on slowly. Elias noticed how Marisol's shoulders tensed with each jolting step, though she never complained. After 2 hours, he called a halt near a sheltered hollow. "Need to rest the mule," he said, not mentioning how he'd seen her gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands. Marisol nodded gratefully, accepting his help to dismount. They shared jerky and water while sitting on a fallen log. The winter silence wrapped around them, broken only by the soft nickering of the mule and dog's quiet panting. By midday, they came across the first signs of Holcomb's gang. Fresh wagon ruts cut ugly gashes through the snow, heading toward Dry Fork. Marisol's face hardened at the sight. A mile further on, they found the burned remains of a Ute hunting camp. Black circles marked where teepees had stood, with scattered debris and broken cooking tools half buried in the snow. Marisol dismounted, moving through the destruction with quiet grace. She knelt beside a small beaded moccasin, lifting it with trembling hands. "They destroy what they cannot steal," she said softly. "My people, the Ute, the Paiute, all suffer from such men." Her voice caught. My husband tried to stop them. That is why they killed him." Elias stood silent, watching her replace the moccasin with careful respect. The weight of her grief filled the space between them, familiar as his own. They made camp that evening beneath a rocky ridge, using an overhanging ledge for shelter. Elias built a small fire, while Marisol laid out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. The stars emerged one by one as darkness settled over the land. After a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, they sat wrapped in blankets, watching the fires dance. Dog sprawled between them, head on her paws. "Sarah loved the stars," Elias said suddenly, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. "Used to sit out summer nights, naming the patterns she saw up there." Marisol's voice was gentle. "Tell me about her." The words came slowly at first, like water breaking through long, frozen ground. He spoke of Sarah's laugh, her garden, how she'd sing while hanging laundry, how the fever took her one harsh winter, leaving him alone with his grief. "I ran to these mountains," he admitted. "Figured if I stayed away from folks, I couldn't lose no one else." "Grief is a hard teacher," Marisol said softly. She touched the silver band on her finger. "John, my husband, he taught at the mission school. He believed education could bridge the gap between our peoples." Her smile held both pride and sorrow. "He died protecting our spring, our way of life. Some nights I still hear his voice in the wind." They fell silent, each lost in memories. The fire crackled, sending sparks toward the star-filled sky. Though neither spoke again, something shifted between them. A recognition of shared pain, of understanding that went deeper than words. Dog whined softly, pressing closer to Elias's leg. He absently scratched her ears, watching Marisol across the flames. Her face was peaceful despite the bruises, strength and grace evident in every line. For the first time in 12 years, his heart stirred with something beyond grief. The night deepened around their small camp, while overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, watching over two wounded souls beginning to heal. The first gray light of dawn painted the sky as Elias and Marisol guided their mule down into a dry wash. Weathered sandstone walls rose around them, their red-streaked layers telling stories of ancient floods. Dog padded ahead, her nose working the sandy ground. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning silence. The bullet kicked up sand near the mule's hooves, making the animal dance sideways. Elias reacted instantly, pushing Marisol behind a boulder while scanning the wash's rim. "There!" Marisol whispered, pointing to movement among the scrub oak above. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Dog growled, hackles raised. Elias spotted the shooter, a young man in a dusty duster, scrambling to reload. "Gang scout," Elias muttered. He drew his old Sharps rifle smoothly, years of hunting making the motion natural as breathing. But instead of aiming to kill, he sent a warning shot that splintered the branch by the scout's head. "Next one won't miss," Elias called out, his deep voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Throw down your gun and come quiet." The scout hesitated. Then his rifle clattered down the slope. He followed, hands raised, fear clear on his young face. "Please, mister, I was just supposed to watch the trail," he stammered. Elias kept his rifle steady while Marisol gathered the scout's weapons. The young man couldn't meet her eyes, shame coloring his features as he recognized her. "Mercy's heavier than a bullet," Elias said gruffly, lowering his rifle. "But you ain't riding free to warn your friends neither." They bound the scout securely to a twisted juniper, using his own rope. Marisol's hands were gentle but firm as she tied the knots, remembering her own ordeal just days before. "Someone will find you," she told him quietly. "Use this time to consider your choices." They left him with water and continued through the wash, emerging onto rolling grassland. By midday, the square white walls of St. Catherine's Mission came into view. its small bell tower stark against the winter sky. A woman in plain dark dress hurried out to meet them, her gray-streaked hair escaping a practical bun. "Marisol, thank the Lord!" She embraced Marisol carefully, mindful of her injuries. "We've been sick with worry." "Sister Agnes," Marisol smiled, returning the embrace. "Is Thomas—" "Mama!" A small figure burst from the mission door. Thomas Tenbears, all of 9 years old, ran full tilt across the yard. He threw himself into his mother's arms, nearly knocking her off balance. Elias steadied them both with a gentle hand. "My son, my brave one," Marisol murmured in Navajo, holding Thomas close. Tears streaked her cheeks as she stroked his dark hair. Elias watched them, something tight in his chest loosening. The boy's face was all Marisol, same quiet strength, same depth of feeling. When Thomas finally looked up, his eyes were serious beyond his years. "You helped my mama?" he asked Elias. "Reckon we helped each other," Elias answered honestly. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded solemnly. "Thank you." He reached out and took Elias's huge hand in his small one, the gesture natural as sunshine. Sister Agnes ushered them inside the mission's kitchen, where cornbread and bean soup waited. As they ate, she shared grave news. "Holcomb's men have Sheriff Davis in their pocket," she said, pouring coffee into tin cups. "They've been pressuring every homesteader and tribal family from here to Dry Fork. Those who resist face accidents." Her mouth tightened. 3 families lost barns to mysterious fires last month. "We cannot let them steal the spring," Marisol said. "The deed must be registered before they file their false claim." Sister Agnes nodded. "Preacher Dalton might help. He has influence with Judge Hayworth, and he's not afraid of Holcomb's gang." She glanced at the darkening windows. "But tonight, you'll rest here. The mission has thick walls and good locks." Later, as night settled over the land, Elias stood watch by the kitchen window. Inside, Marisol sat in a rocking chair, Thomas curled in her lap despite being almost too big for it. She hummed softly, an old Navajo melody that seemed to drift through time itself. Elias felt the boy's earlier touch like a brand on his palm. How long since he'd felt such simple trust? How long since he'd allowed himself to care about anyone's fate but his own? Dog pressed against his leg, her warm weight anchoring him to the present. Through the window, stars pierced the darkness like distant campfires. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, in this peaceful kitchen, hope bloomed quiet as a desert flower. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold as the small group prepared to leave St. Catherine's mission. Sister Agnes pressed a bundle of cornbread and dried apples into Marisol's hands, her weathered face creased with worry. Elias lifted Thomas onto his horse, settling the boy securely in front of him. The child sat straight and proud, though his small hands gripped the saddle horn tightly. Marisol mounted the sure-footed mule, her movements careful but determined. "Lord keep you safe," Sister Agnes called softly as they rode out, Dog trotting beside them. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they followed a narrow trail through stands of pine and aspen. Frost crackled under the animals' hooves, and their breath rose in white clouds. Thomas pointed out rabbit tracks in patches of snow, his excitement warming the quiet morning. Near midday, they approached a frozen creek where skeletal willows lined the banks. Dog suddenly stiffened, her ears pricking forward. Elias reached for his rifle, but Marisol raised her hand. "Wait," she said, her eyes fixed on the willows. "Henry? Henry Cloudwalker?" A figure emerged from the brush like a shadow taking form. He was tall and lean, dressed in a mixture of native and settler clothing, with a Winchester rifle carried easily in the crook of his arm. His dark eyes missed nothing as he surveyed their group. "Sister Marisol," he said, inclining his head, "I have been following the gang's trail these 3 days." "You know this man?" Elias asked, his hand still near his weapon. Marisol nodded. Henry is Ute, a scout who has helped many families in these mountains. My husband once saved his sister from mountain fever. Since then, our families have been bound by friendship and debt. Henry moved closer, his moccasins silent on the frozen ground. The gang makes trouble for all people, native and settler alike. They burned our hunting camp. His face hardened. I tracked them toward Dry Fork, where they meet with a man who makes false papers. We must reach the town before market day, Marisol said. Can you guide us through the mountain pass? The main trail will be watched. Elias shifted in his saddle. How do we know we can trust him? Because I owe a life debt, Henry said simply, and because the water from that spring feeds Ute lands too. If Holcomb's men take it, many will suffer. Marisol met Elias's questioning look. I trust Henry with my life, and my son's. Something in her quiet certainty made Elias nod slowly. Lead on, then. Henry guided them up a barely visible trail that switched back through steep terrain. The temperature dropped as they climbed, and patches of snow grew deeper. Thomas huddled closer to Elias's chest, protected from the wind by the big man's bulk. Near sunset, they faced their greatest challenge. The trail narrowed along a sheer rock face, barely wide enough for the animals to pass. Below, an icy ravine dropped away into shadow. Henry went first, testing each step. Marisol followed, the mule picking its way carefully. Suddenly, loose shale shifted under the mule's hooves. The animal stumbled, sliding toward the edge. Marisol cried out, but Henry was already moving. He lunged, grabbing the mule's bridle, while Elias dismounted in one fluid motion and steadied the animal from behind. For a heart-stopping moment, they all balanced between safety and disaster. Easy now, Elias murmured, his huge hands gentle on the trembling mule. Easy there. Together they guided the mule back to solid ground. Marisol's face was pale, but her voice was steady as she thanked them. Thomas had watched the whole scene with huge eyes, gripping the saddle horn white-knuckled. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, the fire's glow holding back the darkness. After a simple meal of cornbread and jerky, Henry spoke of what he had learned while tracking the gang. They plan to file their false claims on market day, he said, feeding a stick to the flames. Many people will be in town, easier to hide their business among the crowd. They have a man who copies official seals, makes documents look real. How many days? Elias asked. 3, Henry replied. The pass ahead is dangerous, but it will save us a day's ride. Marisol wrapped her shawl tighter against the night air. Then we must risk it. The true deed must be registered before they can file their lies. Thomas had fallen asleep against his mother's side, his young face peaceful in the firelight. Dog lay close by, her watchful presence a comfort to them all. Above their camp, stars wheeled in the vast mountain sky, while somewhere ahead, Dry Fork waited with its promise of justice or treachery. Dark clouds rolled in from the west as they descended the mountain trail, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through their warmest layers. Henry led them along a narrow path between towering pines, their branches heavy with threatening snow. Storm's coming fast, Elias called out, pulling his coat tighter around Thomas. The boy had grown quiet, huddled against the mountain man's chest for warmth. Marisol's mule picked its way carefully down the slope, its hooves sliding on patches of ice. The first fat snowflakes began to fall, carried sideways by the strengthening wind. There's an old line shack ahead, Henry said, pointing through the thickening snow. Built by trappers years ago. We should shelter there. They found the cabin tucked against a granite outcropping, its log walls weathered but solid. Dog bounded ahead through deepening snow, nose working the air for any sign of danger. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a single room thick with dust and shadows. Inside, they found a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and bunks built into the wall, Henry and Elias worked quickly to gather wood from the lean-to out back, while Marisol settled Thomas near the fireplace. Soon, flames crackled in the hearth, pushing back the growing darkness. But as the storm intensified outside, so did Elias's restlessness. He paced the small cabin, checking the windows where snow was already piling up against the glass. "We're losing too much time," he muttered. "Market day's coming, and we're stuck here while Holcomb's gang gets closer to filing their false claim." "The storm will pass," Marisol said quietly, helping Thomas warm his hands by the fire. "We must trust in Creator's timing." "Trust won't stop them from stealing your water rights," Elias growled, his voice harsher than he intended. Henry had taken up position near the door, his rifle across his knees. "The gang must also wait out this storm. We will make up the time." But Elias barely heard him. The howling wind had awakened old memories he'd fought hard to bury. Another storm, 12 years ago. Another cabin, his wife Sarah burning with fever and him unable to get her to town through the blizzard. The helplessness crashed over him again, and he retreated to the darkest corner of the cabin, his broad shoulders hunched against the weight of remembrance. Thomas had fallen asleep on one of the bunks, wrapped in blankets with dog curled protectively nearby. Henry dozed by the door, leaving Marisol and Elias alone in the flickering firelight. She approached him slowly, like one might a spooked horse. "What haunts you tonight, Elias Boone?" "Nothing that needs speaking of," he said roughly, but his eyes betrayed him, fixed on the storm beyond the frosted window. "I think it does need speaking," Marisol said, her voice gentle but firm. "You carry your pain like a shield, but it weighs you down instead of protecting you." The wind rattled the cabin's walls, and Elias's jaw tightened. "I lost my wife in a storm like this. Couldn't get her to help in time. Been 12 years, but nights like this bring it all back." "And that's why you hide away in your mountain cabin? Why you try so hard not to care about anyone?" Her words struck true, and Elias turned to face her. Caring didn't save Sarah. Caring just means watching helpless while people you love suffer. "No," Marisol said softly. "Caring is what makes us human. It's what gives us strength to face the storms together instead of alone." She touched his arm lightly. "Why are you so afraid to care again?" The question hung in the air between them, punctuated by the howling wind. Elias stared into the fire, his voice barely audible. "Because the emptiness is easier than the fear of losing someone else." "Is it?" Marisol asked. "Look at my son sleeping there. Look how he trusts you already, how safe he feels with you near. Is your emptiness easier than his smile when you taught him to track rabbits this morning?" Elias's throat tightened as he watched Thomas's peaceful face in the firelight. The boy had worked his way past Elias's defenses without even trying, just as his mother was doing now with her quiet wisdom. "I reckon," he said slowly. "I've been hiding from more than just people up in those mountains." "The storm that took Sarah is long past," Marisol said. "Don't let it keep taking pieces of your heart." Something broke loose in Elias's chest then, like spring ice cracking on a frozen river. He drew a shuddering breath, and Marisol squeezed his arm gently before returning to check on Thomas. Through the long night, the storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw had begun. By morning, when the sun broke through clearing skies, the snow lay deep and pristine around the cabin. And something else lay buried with yesterday's tracks, a piece of the wall Elias had built around his heart. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as they made their way down the last stretch of mountain trail. Henry guided them along a narrow deer path that skirted Dry Fork's main road, keeping them hidden from any watchful eyes. "Gang's got men posted at every major trail," Henry explained in a hushed voice, pointing to distant ridgelines. "But they don't know these old hunting paths." Elias kept one hand on his rifle, scanning the scattered pine groves for movement. Ahead of him in the saddle, Thomas sat straight-backed and alert, mimicking the mountain man's vigilance. The boy had barely left Elias's side since leaving the line shack, following him like a shadow during their brief rest stops. Marisol rode close behind them, her face set with quiet determination. The deed was secured in an oilskin pouch beneath her shawl, protected from the lingering mountain damp. The white wooden steeple of Dry Forks Church emerged through the morning mist as they approached from the east. Henry raised his hand, signaling them to halt in a grove of aspens. "I'll scout ahead," he whispered, disappearing into the underbrush with practiced silence. They waited, listening to the soft clicking of their horses' bits and the distant sound of the town awakening. Thomas leaned back against Elias's chest, seeking comfort in the man's solid presence. Henry returned 15 minutes later, nodding. "Path to the church is clear. Preacher's waiting." They dismounted in the church's small stable, where Preacher Silas Dalton met them with grave eyes and firm handshakes. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in Marisol's fading bruises and the wariness in their expressions. "Sister Agnes sent word you were coming," he said, leading them through the back door of the church. "Though I confess I didn't expect such distinguished company." He nodded respectfully to Henry, then studied Elias with knowing eyes. "The mountain man of Thunder Valley, if I'm not mistaken." "Just Elias will do, preacher," he replied gruffly. Inside his study, Dalton closed the heavy wooden door and drew the curtains. Morning light filtered through colored glass, casting rainbow patterns across the worn floorboards. Thomas stayed close to Elias, one small hand gripping the man's coat sleeve. Marisol withdrew the deed from its wrapping, handling the document with reverence. "We need a witness of standing, preacher, someone the town trusts." Dalton examined the paper carefully, running his finger along the official seals. "This is legitimate, right enough. Judge Hayworth's signature, properly notarized." He looked up, his expression troubled. "But Holcomb's gang has the sheriff in their pocket, and half the town council fears them too much to act." "That's why we need you," Elias said, his deep voice resonating in the small room. "Need to make this public where they can't hide it." The preacher stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Tomorrow's Sunday service. Every soul in Dry Fork will be here, including the town council." A slight smile crossed his face. "Hard for corruption to flourish in God's house, with 200 witnesses looking on." "We don't have that kind of time," Elias growled. "Gangs filing their false claim first thing Monday morning." "Then Sunday service is our best chance," Marisol said quietly. Her calm voice drew everyone's attention. "The town must choose, stand with justice or bow to fear, but they must choose in the light, before God and their neighbors." Dalton nodded slowly. "I can offer you sanctuary here until then. The church has hidden rooms, used in darker days when peace between settlers and tribes was harder to find." "No," Elias said firmly, surprising himself with the force of his conviction. "We face this now, today. Get your witnesses together, preacher. Let's end this before more good folks get hurt." "That's dangerous talk, friend," Dalton warned. "Holcomb's men won't hesitate to use violence, even here." "Then we trust in Creator to guide our path," Marisol said, placing her hand on Thomas's shoulder. The boy looked up at Elias, his young face full of trust and determination. "Mr. Elias will protect us," Thomas said with complete certainty, "like he protected Mama when the bad men hurt her." Something tightened in Elias's chest at the boy's words, at the pure faith in those dark eyes. Without thinking, he placed his large hand over Thomas's smaller one, still gripping his coat sleeve. "That's right, boy," he said softly. "Ain't nothing going to harm you or your mama while I'm breathing." Dalton watched this exchange, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Very well," he said, reaching for his coat. "Give me 1 hour to gather the town council. We'll meet in the church proper." He paused at the door. "And friends? I'll be praying for us all." As the preacher's footsteps faded down the hall, Elias felt Thomas press closer to his side. The boy's trust, Marisol's quiet strength, and their shared purpose filled the room with something he hadn't felt in years. The warmth of belonging, of fighting for something bigger than himself. The morning sun rose higher, streaming through the colored glass in brilliant shafts of light, as they waited for Dalton's return, and the confrontation that would decide not just Marisol's claim, but the future of Dry Fork itself. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows through Dry Fork's church windows, painting the wooden pews with stripes of golden light. Frost patterns decorated the glass panes like delicate lace, and the pot-bellied stove at the back radiated welcome warmth through the packed sanctuary. Elias stood at the rear, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorway. His eyes swept constantly over the congregation, noting familiar faces and watching for trouble. Marisol sat in the last pew with Thomas pressed close to her side, her deed safely tucked within the folds of her best shawl. Henry Cloudwalker had positioned himself near a side window, seemingly at ease but alert as a hunting hawk. Preacher Dalton's voice filled the small church, strong and clear as he delivered his sermon. "The good book speaks often of justice and mercy," he said, his gray eyes meeting those of his congregation. "Not as separate virtues, but as twin pillars that hold up the very house of God." The wooden floorboards creaked as people shifted in their seats. Some faces showed discomfort, others hope. Elias recognized several of Holcomb's men scattered through the crowd, their expressions dark. "When we allow injustice to prosper," Dalton continued, "we poison the very wells from which our community drinks. Both the water that sustains our bodies," he paused meaningfully, "and the truth that sustains our souls." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Elias noticed Judge Hayworth, seated quietly near the front, nodding slightly at the preacher's words. "And now," Dalton said, "I've asked someone to share her story, a story of both justice and mercy. Marisol Tenbears, would you come forward?" The murmuring grew louder as Marisol rose gracefully. She squeezed Thomas's hand before walking toward the front, her head held high. Elias moved too, positioning himself near the pulpit, his presence both protective and reassuring. Marisol faced the congregation, her voice steady and clear. "My late husband and I purchased the spring that feeds this valley legally, with witnesses and proper documents." She withdrew the deed from her shawl. "This paper bears the signatures of both the Indian agent and Judge Hayworth himself." Before she could continue, the church doors burst open with a bang that made several people jump. Mace Holcomb strode down the center aisle, his boots striking the floorboards like hammer blows. Two of his men flanked him, hands hovering near their gun belts. "This is blasphemy!" Holcomb's voice boomed through the church. "You'd let this woman stand in God's house and present forged papers?" Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Holcomb and Marisol. "Only blasphemy here is stealing water rights through false claims, Holcomb." "You're a long way from your mountain, Boone," Holcomb sneered. "This ain't your fight." "Reckon it became my fight when your men left a woman to freeze to death in my valley." Elias's voice carried to every corner of the church. "This ain't about water anymore. It's about the soul of Dry Fork itself." The congregation sat in tense silence as Holcomb's face darkened with rage. But before he could respond, another voice spoke up. "The deed is genuine." Judge Hayworth stood, his judicial authority filling the small church despite his modest stature. "I signed it myself, witnessed proper payment, and recorded it in the territorial registry." He moved to the front, examining the document Marisol held. "Every seal and signature is authentic." A wave of whispers swept through the pews. Holcomb's men began to look uncertain, glancing at their leader for direction. "The spring belongs to the Tenbears family," Judge Hayworth continued. "Any other claim is fraudulent under territorial law." Preacher Dalton stepped forward. "The truth has been spoken in God's house, before these witnesses." His voice grew stronger. "What matters now is how we respond to it." The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Then, from the middle of the congregation, old Sarah Miller stood up. "I say we've had enough of bullies stealing what ain't theirs." Her weathered face showed no fear as she looked directly at Holcomb. "That spring water feeds all our farms. Better it belongs to honest folks who'll share it fair." Like a dam breaking, others began to stand. The blacksmith, the general store owner, farmers and ranchers whose lands depended on the spring water. Soon, most of the congregation was on their feet, their united presence pushing back against years of intimidation. Someone began to clap, a slow, deliberate applause that spread through the church like ripples on water. It was aimed at Marisol, acknowledging her courage, her dignity, her unwavering stand for justice. Holcomb stood isolated in the aisle, his face twisted with impotent rage as his power visibly crumbled. For one bright moment, peace seemed to hover within reach, carried on the wings of truth and community courage. The evening brought a gentle calm to Preacher Dalton's rectory. Oil lamps cast warm circles of light across the worn wooden table, where empty coffee cups and half-eaten biscuits testified to their modest celebration. The air smelled of pine logs burning in the hearth and Sister Agnes's cinnamon tea. Thomas had curled up in Elias's massive arms, his small frame dwarfed by the mountain man's bulk. The boy's breathing came slow and steady, his face peaceful in sleep. Elias found himself unconsciously rocking, just as he had done with his own son so many years ago. The weight of the child in his arms stirred something deep within him, something he'd thought long buried in that lonely grave beside his wife. Marisol watched them from her seat by the fire, her dark eyes soft with emotion. Henry Cloudwalker stood near the window, his silhouette sharp against the gathering dusk, as he kept watch over the quiet street. "The boy trusts you," Preacher Dalton said softly to Elias, pouring fresh coffee. "Children know true hearts when they meet them." Elias grunted softly, careful not to disturb Thomas. "Reckon he's just wore out from all the excitement." "Don't sell yourself short, friend." Dalton's weathered face grew serious. "But I fear today's victory may come with a price. Mace Holcomb isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. His pride won't let him walk away." "Let him come," Henry said from the window, his voice low but firm. "We'll be ready." Before anyone could respond, the rectory door burst open. Deacon Mills stumbled in, his face red from running, his breath coming in gasps. "Fire! They've set fire to the schoolhouse." Elias's heart clenched. "Sister Agnes's orphans!" "Still inside," the deacon wheezed. "Holcomb's men. They've blocked the doors." Elias carefully transferred the sleeping Thomas to Marisol's arms. The boy stirred, but didn't wake. "Henry?" The Ute tracker was already moving, grabbing his rifle. "I know where they keep water barrels behind the mercantile." "Preacher, ring that fire bell," Elias commanded, his voice hard as iron. "Rally every able body in town." They burst into the street as the church bell began its frantic pealing. Orange flames already lit the night sky at the south end of town, casting diabolic shadows against the buildings. Smoke rolled thick and black against the stars. Elias and Henry sprinted toward the mercantile, shouting as they ran, "Fire at the schoolhouse! Every bucket, every barrel, come help!" Townspeople emerged from homes and businesses, drawn by the bell's urgent clanging, but they hesitated, watching the flames with fear-frozen faces. Elias saw the paralysis in their eyes, the same terror that had let Holcomb control them for so long. "What if Holcomb's men start shooting?" someone called out. "They'll burn our own places next," another voice cried. The crowd shifted uncertainly, caught between conscience and cowardice. In the distance, children's screams pierced the crackle of flames. Elias climbed onto a water trough, his massive frame silhouetted against the fire-lit sky. His voice boomed out like thunder across the square. "You're either water for life or fire for ruin. Choose now!" The words seemed to break some spell. The general store owner was the first to move, rushing to unlock his storehouse. "I've got buckets. Form a line." Others followed, the blacksmith and his apprentices, ranch hands, shopkeepers, wives and mothers. They grabbed buckets, barrels, anything that could carry water. A line formed from the town well to the schoolhouse, hands passing containers with growing determination. Henry appeared with a wagon of water barrels, already organizing men to flank the building. Preacher Dalton directed the bucket brigade, his voice strong and sure over the chaos. "Those are our children in there!" Sister Agnes's voice rang out as she pushed through the crowd. "God will not forgive us if we stand idle." The tide of humanity surged forward. Where Holcomb's men had stood guard, they now fell back before the sheer weight of townspeople's resolve. Elias and Henry led the charge to the schoolhouse doors, kicking them open as others doused the flames with water. Smoke billowed out as children stumbled into the night air, coughing and crying. Willing hands reached out to catch them, carry them to safety, wrap them in warm blankets. The bucket line moved faster, voices calling encouragement, working as one to drown the destroying flames. Hour after hour they worked, until the last ember died and dawn began to pale the eastern sky. The schoolhouse stood scorched but solid, saved by the united effort of a town that had finally found its courage. As the sun rose, Elias looked out over the soot-stained faces of his neighbors. Where there had been fear, he now saw pride. Where there had been division, he saw unity. The night's trial by fire had forged something stronger than Holcomb's threats. It had forged a community. The bucket brigade stretched from the town well to the schoolhouse, hands passing water with desperate speed. Smoke poured from the building's windows, thick and black against the night sky. Sister Agnes's voice could be heard from inside, calling out to calm the frightened children. Elias, Henry, and Preacher Dalton gathered at the schoolhouse door, bandanas tied over their faces. "Stay low," Henry advised, his eyes sharp in the firelight. "The smoke rises." They burst through the door together, ducking beneath the roiling black clouds that filled the upper half of the room. The heat struck them like a physical blow. Through the haze, they could make out Sister Agnes herding a group of children towards the back corner, away from where flames licked up the far wall. "This way," Dalton called out, his voice muffled by the bandana. "Follow my voice." Sister Agnes turned, relief visible even through the smoke. "Thank the Lord! Some of the little ones are too scared to move." Elias crawled forward on his hands and knees, the floorboards hot beneath his palms. He reached the first child, a small girl frozen in terror, and scooped her into his arms. "Close your eyes, little one. Old Elias has got you now." Henry moved with the swift grace of an experienced tracker, gathering 2 more children. Dalton helped Sister Agnes guide the older ones toward the door. The bucket brigade's water was starting to make headway. The roar of the flames diminished slightly, though smoke still churned through the room. Outside, Marisol had taken charge of caring for the rescued children. She directed women to bring blankets and clean water, checking each child for burns or signs of smoke sickness. Her calm efficiency helped keep panic at bay as parents rushed forward to claim their little ones. "Breathe slow and steady," she instructed a coughing boy, rubbing his back. "The smoke will clear from your lungs." 3 more trips into the burning building, and finally Sister Agnes confirmed all children were accounted for. The bucket brigade continued their work, drowning the last of the flames. Dawn was breaking, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of pink and gold. That's when 9-year-old Thomas, who had been helping pass water despite his mother's protests, spotted a familiar figure trying to slip away down an alley. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "That's Mr. Holcomb! He's running away!" Elias's head snapped up at Thomas's cry. Without a word, he sprinted after the fleeing man, his long legs eating up the distance. Henry moved to cut off any escape route through the back alleys, while several townsmen joined the chase. Holcomb ran hard, but he was no match for Elias's wilderness-hardened endurance. The mountain man caught him at the livery stable, where Holcomb had hoped to grab a horse. Elias seized him by the collar and slammed him against the stable wall, his massive fist raised. The gathered crowd tensed, expecting violence, but Elias stopped, his fist slowly lowering as he stared into Holcomb's terrified face. The morning light revealed the land speculator's true nature. Not a fearsome tyrant, but a coward whose power came from others' fear. "Reckon it'd be easy to give you the beating you deserve," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the dawn quiet. "But that ain't justice. You're going to stand right here and tell these good folks every detail of your schemes, every forged deed, every threat, every penny stolen." Holcomb tried to sneer, but his bravado crumbled before the united front of townspeople gathering around them. These weren't the cowed, isolated settlers he'd bullied for so long. The night's trial had forged them into something stronger. "They won't believe you over me," Holcomb blustered. "I'm a businessman of reputation." "A reputation built on lies." Preacher Dalton stepped forward, his clothes still smelling of smoke. "The truth has a way of coming to light, Mr. Holcomb. Best get ahead of it while you can." Henry Cloudwalker emerged from the shadows, rifle held casual but ready. The Ute Tribal Council would also be interested in hearing about certain missing cattle and burned camps. Holcomb's shoulders sagged. Looking at the resolute faces surrounding him, settlers and natives, ranchers and townspeople, all standing together, he seemed to age years in moments. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell it all." As the sun climbed higher, Holcomb confessed his crimes before the assembled town. Judge Hayworth, summoned from his home, took official testimony. The web of fraud and intimidation unraveled with each revelation, and with it unraveled Holcomb's hold over Dry Fork. Marisol stood beside Elias as they watched the former tyrant led away to await trial. "You could have chosen vengeance," she said softly. "Many would say he deserved it." "Vengeance just feeds the fire," Elias replied, looking down at her. "Mercy's like water. It can wash things clean, give new life a chance to grow." Thomas slipped his small hand into Elias's large one. "Like the spring on our land?" "Just like that, boy." Elias squeezed the child's hand gently. "Just like that." Morning sunlight streamed through Dry Fork's courthouse windows as townspeople filled the wooden benches. Judge Hayworth sat behind his massive oak desk, his silver spectacles catching the light as he reviewed the documents before him. 2 federal marshals stood guard, while Holcomb and his remaining men sat in chains, their faces drawn with defeat. The judge's gavel cracked against wood, bringing the murmuring crowd to silence. "In the matter of water rights concerning Ten Bears Spring," he began, his voice carrying the weight of law, "this court formally recognizes the deed, held by Marisol Ten Bears, as authentic and binding." He lifted the carefully preserved document, showing the official seals. "Furthermore, in accordance with Mrs. Ten Bears's wishes and tribal council agreement, the spring shall be registered as shared property between the Ute people and the town of Dry Fork, ensuring water access for all law-abiding citizens." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. Marisol stood tall near the front, Thomas at her side, both dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion. The boy's eyes shone with pride as he watched the judge sign the final papers with flourishing strokes. At the back of the courthouse, Elias shifted uncomfortably, feeling out of place in his cleaned but worn buckskins. His weathered hands, still bearing scabs from the schoolhouse fire, twisted his hat brim. The magnitude of change sweeping through his life made his chest tight. He had lived so long in isolation, convinced he deserved no more than solitude. Now, watching Marisol's quiet triumph, he felt unworthy of the warmth growing in his heart. As the judge ordered Holcomb and his men transported to territorial prison, Elias slipped outside onto the courthouse steps. The morning air carried the scent of sage and coming spring, but he barely noticed, lost in his thoughts. Soft footsteps approached behind him. "Why do you hide from Joy?" Marisol's voice was gentle as she came to stand beside him. She reached for his rough hand, her smaller one fitting naturally against his palm. "Ain't hiding," Elias mumbled. though he couldn't meet her eyes. "Just reckon you deserve better than some old mountain man who—" "Pa!" Thomas burst through the courthouse doors, the word stopping Elias's breath in his throat. The boy wrapped his arms around Elias's waist, looking up with complete trust. "Pa, the judge wants to know if you'll help oversee the spring's care, since you know the mountains so well." Elias's free hand came to rest on Thomas's shoulder, trembling slightly. He looked from the boy to Marisol, seeing in her smile all the second chances he'd never dared hope for. "Your heart knows what it needs," Marisol said softly. "Will you trust it?" The morning after the courthouse victory, Elias stood among a dozen townspeople gathered at the charred schoolhouse. His massive shoulders straightened as he studied the fire damage. Sister Agnes had already swept away the ashes, and fresh lumber lay stacked nearby, ready for the rebuilding. "Reckon we ought to start with them support beams," Elias said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Men nodded in agreement, and soon the air filled with the sounds of hammers and saws. Elias worked tirelessly, his strength making quick work of the heavy lifting. He hoisted thick wooden beams overhead as if they were kindling, setting them precisely where the other men directed. The familiar burn of honest labor felt different now, purposeful, shared. Sister Agnes moved among the workers, offering water and encouragement. When Elias paused to wipe sweat from his brow, she approached with a tin cup. "You've got quite a way with building things," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Same way you've got with young Thomas. The makings of a fine father, if you ask me." Elias ducked his head, but couldn't hide the slight smile that crossed his weathered face. "Much obliged, sister," he mumbled, turning back to his work. But her words settled deep in his chest, warming him more than the afternoon sun. As dusk approached and the day's work wound down, Marisol appeared at the schoolyard gate. Her dark eyes took in the progress. New beams rising strong against the purple sky, promise of restoration clear in every fresh-cut board. "We would be honored if you would join us for supper," she said to Elias, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had first caught his attention by the creek. "Nothing fancy, just family food." The word family made his heart skip, but he found himself nodding. An hour later, cleaned up as best he could, Elias sat at Marisol's table. Steam rose from a pot of hearty stew, and the scent of fresh fry bread filled the small house. Tomas chattered excitedly about helping with the schoolhouse repairs tomorrow, while Marisol passed warm bread and shared stories of her grandmother's cooking. Lamplight cast soft shadows on the walls, and laughter came easier than Elias ever expected. He watched Thomas demonstrate how he would swing a hammer, saw Marisol hide her smile behind her hand, and felt something shift inside his chest. His line shack up in the hills suddenly seemed very far away, and for the first time, that distance didn't pain him. Here, in this warm kitchen with these two souls, he had found his true home. The warm afternoon sun had begun melting patches of snow into tiny streams that trickled down the mountainside. Elias guided his horse along the narrow trail, with Marisol riding beside him on her newly acquired paint mare. The path to the spring wound through stands of aspen trees, their bare branches reaching toward the brightening sky. Elias carried tools and lumber across his saddle, pieces of seasoned pine he'd carefully selected for the bench he planned to build. The closer they rode to the spring, the more his heart settled into a peaceful rhythm. This wasn't just Marisol's water source anymore. It had become a symbol of their shared purpose. When they reached the spring, its clear water bubbled up from the earth with renewed vigor, free from winter's icy grip. Elias dismounted first, then offered his hand to help Marisol down. She accepted with a grace that still amazed him, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Right here," Marisol said, indicating a spot beneath an old juniper tree that overlooked the spring. "My people have gathered at this place for generations." Elias nodded and set to work. His strong hands shaped the wood with practiced skill, while Marisol gathered early spring herbs that grew near the water's edge. The sound of his saw and hammer mixed with her soft humming of an ancient Navajo melody. As he finished securing the last board, Marisol approached with a handful of sage. "In our way," she explained, "water is life itself. We are not owners but guardians." She smiled, watching him smooth the bench's rough edges. "You understand this too in your own way." "Reckon I'm learning," Elias replied softly. "About being a guardian of more than just water." They sat together on the newly built bench, its pine boards still fresh and golden in the late afternoon light. Marisol's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if completing a pattern long ago set in motion. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for saving my life that morning, but for showing mercy when others would have chosen vengeance. You've taught Thomas, and all of Dry Fork, what true strength looks like." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the spring. Elias turned to face Marisol, his heart full of something deeper than mere longing. When he leaned forward to kiss her, it felt like sealing a sacred promise. His lips met hers with gentle reverence, a covenant of shared life, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grows steady and strong, like water wearing smooth paths through stone. The summer sun warmed the gathered crowd in Dry Fork's town square. 6 months had passed since that snowy morning when Elias had found Marisol bound to a tree, and the town had transformed as surely as winter had yielded to summer's embrace. Elias stood tall beside the newly constructed stone well, his wife Marisol's hand tucked in his. Her silver and turquoise wedding band caught the sunlight, matching the one on his own weathered finger. Thomas pressed against his side, no longer the wary boy he'd once been, but a son in every way that mattered. Preacher Dalton stepped forward, his Bible tucked under one arm as he addressed the townspeople and tribal members who had gathered for the dedication. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "we're here to celebrate more than just a well. We're here to honor second chances, the kind that come when we choose to lay down our weapons and pick up hope instead." Elias felt Marisol squeeze his hand, remembering their own second chance at love. The morning glory vines she'd planted around their new home's porch posts reminded him daily of life's ability to bloom again after loss. "Pa," Thomas whispered, tugging at Elias's sleeve. "Can we show them the sign now?" Elias nodded, and together they stepped forward with the wooden plaque they'd spent the past week carving. Thomas had insisted on helping, his small hands guided by Elias's larger ones as they shaped each letter. Now they mounted it above the well for all to see. "Waters of mercy, protected by all." The crowd murmured appreciatively, and Sister Agnes wiped a tear from her eye. Henry Cloudwalker, who had become a frequent visitor to their home, nodded in approval from where he stood with other tribal elders. Later that afternoon, as the celebration wound down, Elias took Thomas into the foothills above town. The boy had been begging to learn tracking, and Elias's heart swelled with pride as he showed his son how to read the signs of mule deer passing through. "See here?" Elias pointed to a set of tracks. "Notice how fresh these are?" Thomas crouched down, studying the marks with intense concentration. When he correctly identified the direction the deer had traveled, his face lit up with joy. His laughter echoed across the valley as he spotted more signs, each discovery celebrated with the pure delight only a child could express. Elias watched his son, marveling at how the weight of grief he'd carried for so many years had lifted. The mountains still stood tall and wild around them, but they no longer seemed like walls holding him in solitude. Instead, they were simply the beautiful boundaries of home, a home filled with family, faith, and the kind of peace he'd thought forever lost. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.